You know when something inside you whispers, very softly, that it's best not to go any further, but you still do? Well, that's exactly how it all began. I'd investigated disappearances, cults, and crimes without bodies, but never a case where the place itself seemed to have a will of its own. Morwen Island. The name sounds pretty, but it carries a history that time tried to bury, and failed. They say the sea around that island speaks, not with words, but with promises. Promises of return, redemption, of something the human mind was never meant to comprehend. And the curious thing is that those who hear this call rarely return the same. I learned this the hard way. This investigation began as a simple case of serial disappearances. But the deeper I delved into the evidence, the more I realized I wasn't just following people's tracks. I was following the tracks of something alive. Something that refuses to be forgotten. And before we begin, I want to know where you watching from right now. Leave your city in the comments. I might have already investigated a case very close to you. I remember exactly the morning I received the call. The detective's voice sounded shaky, almost relieved, to share with me the weight of something no one wanted to touch. A group of tourists had disappeared on an isolated island off the north coast. No sign, no message, nothing. The kind of case where you can smell the fear even before you hear the details. At first, I thought it was just another maritime tragedy, but the way he mentioned the name of the place chilled me to the core. Morwen Island. I'd heard that name before in old reports, surrounded by confidentiality seals and hand-scribbled notes. They said the government had sealed off the island decades ago, after a series of disappearances that were never solved. I accepted the case without much thought, as if something inside me already knew it was inevitable. While preparing my equipment and reviewing the few available files, I felt a strange familiarity in the subtext. It was as if the island was calling to me, and honestly, I don't know if it was curiosity or something darker pulling me there. Before leaving, I glanced at the map spread out on my desk. Small notes marked strategic points along the coast, and there, lost among the currents, lay Morwen. Surrounded by legend, forbidden by reason. I didn't know it yet, but that call would change the course of everything I believed about disappearances and about myself. The sea has always had a curious way of testing those who dare to cross it. The moment we left the port, the waves began to grow as if observing us, assessing whether we deserved to reach the other side. The boatman, a man of few words, avoided looking me in the eye. He only said one sentence before the wind drowned out his voice. The island doesn't like visitors. As we moved away from the coast, the sky suddenly darkened, and the smell of rain cut through the air. I tried to stay calm, but the rocking of the boat was almost hypnotic, as if the water itself wanted to swallow me. A thunderclap rang so close that I felt the metal of the handrail vibrate beneath my fingers. For a moment, I thought we wouldn't make it back alive. The storm came without warning, tearing across the horizon in streaks of white light. The bow rose and fell, plunging into the waves with enough force to capsize any ordinary vessel. But that old boat seemed stubborn, like the boatman himself. I clung to the seat, feeling the adrenaline rush through my veins, and wondered if this was just the beginning of what awaited me. When I finally glimpsed the island's silhouette through the mist, the wind died down. The sea, once raging, became almost insultingly calm. The sudden change sent shivers down my spine. There was something there, something I didn't want to find, but which, at the same time, seemed to have been waiting for me for a very long time. When my feet touched the damp island soil, the first thing I felt was silence. Not the usual silence, but one that weighs heavily on your shoulders, that seems to watch your every step. No birdsong, no whisper of wind through the trees. It was as if nature itself had forgotten how to breathe there. The boatman didn't even turn off the engine. He just gave me a quick glance and disappeared with the haste of someone fleeing a ghost. The huts near the beach were in ruins. Roofs caved in, doors ripped off, objects scattered as if someone had fled in the middle of the night. In one of them, I found an overturned chair and a still half-full mug covered in green fungus. A frozen portrait of a life interrupted. The sand around them was marked by ancient footprints, nearly erased by the sea air, as if time had tried to erase the evidence of a secret. Further on, I spotted stones arranged in a circle, all covered with hand-carved symbols. I didn't recognize any language. Some lines resembled tribal designs. Others looked like letters too distorted to make sense. I ran my fingers over one of them and felt a strange warmth, as if the stone were pulsing, alive, but still. As I explored the place, I noticed that every corner of the island seemed to carry a memory, an echo of something that had already happened and that somehow was still happening. It was like walking through a forgotten dream, or a nightmare about to awaken. I entered the largest of the huts, the one that seemed to have withstood the test of time the best. The smell of damp wood and mildew was almost suffocating, but something kept me going. On a makeshift table lay a stack of damp notebooks, a broken camera, and a portable recorder. I touched the rusty button, and, to my surprise, it still worked. The voice that came from it was tremulous, masculine, and said, "They don't sleep. They watch from the forest, waiting for the tide to change." I stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand if it was delirium or despair. The recording continued, interspersed with the sound of wind and heavy footsteps, as if someone were being followed. Leafing through the diaries, I found notes in different handwriting. They all spoke of the same things. Shadows watching from afar, whispers coming from the water, and a feeling of being tested by the island itself. One account struck me. A woman wrote that she dreamed of voices calling her name, and when she woke up, the sand around her hut was covered in circular marks, as if someone had walked around it all night. It was the kind of thing that, in any other context, I would call mass hysteria. But there, I wasn't so sure. I closed the diary and looked out the window. The woods swayed slightly, though the air was still. It was then that I noticed something simple, yet unsettling. The voices from the recording seemed to whisper again, only now from outside the cabin. I returned to the mainland late the next day. The sea seemed heavier, as if it didn't want to let me go. But what awaited me in the village was even stranger. The fishermen watched me silently, with the look of someone who'd seen too much. None of them wanted to talk, until a man with a wrinkled face and a hoarse voice called me to a corner of the pier. He asked if I'd seen the marks. When I said yes, he just shook his head and said, "Then they've heard you too." I tried to press him for answers, but he kept looking away, as if pronouncing the island's name was a mistake. Another, younger fisherman interrupted the conversation and whispered something I only partially understood. Something about those who call the sea by the wrong name. It seemed like a local belief, a superstition, but the tone was too serious to be folklore. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to interview other residents. Most pretended not to know anything. Some simply got up and left when I mentioned the island. One man even made the sign of the cross. There was fear there, an ancient, ingrained fear passed down from generation to generation. And that kind of fear usually stems from something real. As the sun set, I returned to the pier. The old fisherman was still there, smoking silently. Before I boarded, he said one last thing, almost in a whisper. "He who hears the sea calling never returns the same." And in that moment, I knew he wasn't speaking in metaphors. Back at my temporary accommodation, I began reviewing the profiles of the missing. There were 7 tourists, each with such a unique story that, at first glance, it seemed like a coincidence that they were together. But too many coincidences are often a perfect disguise. There was a psychologist, a documentary filmmaker, a former military man, a couple in crisis, a visual artist, and a young anthropology student. They all had one thing in common. Something unfinished was haunting them. While reading the reports and interviews with family members, I realized that none of them seemed exactly stable. The psychologist was going through a grieving process. The ex-soldier, war trauma. The artist had been hospitalized months earlier for sleep disorders. And the documentary filmmaker, the expedition leader, had a curious history of investigating pagan sects and rituals. Together they formed a group that, unconsciously, was searching for something they didn't even know how to name. Delving into the personal diaries found in the backpacks, I noticed a pattern. Everyone wrote about finding themselves again. This type of expression, for those who work with psychological profiles, is a clear sign of existential displacement. People like this become vulnerable to any promise of transcendence or escape. The island, somehow, seemed to know this. While taking notes, I noticed something unsettling. The more I studied the victims, the more their descriptions seemed to mirror parts of myself. Small traumas, fissures, obsessions. As if on some level, the island chose not only who enters, but who needs to get lost in order to find themselves. I returned to the island the next day, driven by a restlessness I couldn't explain. The tide was low, revealing parts of the beach that had previously seemed inaccessible. It was there, near a rock formation covered in silt, that I saw something glistening beneath the sand. I knelt and began digging with my hands, and when the object finally emerged, my heart raced. It was an ancient necklace, made of tarnished metal, with a pendant filled with symbols I'd never seen before. I wiped the surface carefully. The marks resembled a mixture of letters and spirals, as if they told a story, but in a forgotten language. There was something unsettling about it, a sense of familiarity that made no sense. Around the necklace, I noticed footprints. They were human, but they ended abruptly, as if whoever had left them had simply vanished into thin air. I used my cell phone to record everything, but the camera froze. I tried again, and the image came out distorted, as if the air itself were trembling. At that moment, I felt a presence. I can't explain it. It wasn't noise, nor movement. Just the feeling that someone or something was right behind me. I turned quickly, and all I saw was the sea, completely still. I put the necklace in a plastic bag and left. Each step back felt heavier, as if the island was trying to make me give up. But the curious thing is that instead of fear, I felt curiosity, a kind of dangerous fascination, the same that leads people to open doors that should remain closed. That night, the wind felt different. I was sheltering in one of the less damaged huts, reviewing my notes, when I heard the first sound, a dry crack like wood breaking under a bare foot. I closed my notebook, held my breath, and waited. The sound came again, closer, slower. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was the wind, maybe an animal. But the problem is, the wind doesn't circle around a hut. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it out the window. Nothing. Just dense, thick, almost solid darkness. Then I heard, very faintly, something that sounded like a chant. Words drawn out, whispered in a hypnotic rhythm. It came from somewhere in the trees. I couldn't understand the language, but there was a cadence, a kind of ritual, an invocation. The sound was so soft it mingled with the air itself, making me doubt its true existence. I sat back down, trying to ignore it, but every second seemed to prolong the silence until it became unbearable. The feeling of being watched was physical, as if someone were studying me from within the darkness. I touched the necklace I'd found earlier. Unsure why, it felt worn even though it was cold outside. At 3 a.m, I heard something lightly tapping on the outside wall, 3 times at precise intervals. I tried to react, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, listening to my own ragged breathing. And on the last tap, I swear I heard my name being whispered. Not in my head, right there, outside. I spent the rest of the night awake, trying to convince myself that fatigue could explain everything. But when the mind begins to exhaust itself, it opens doors that reason tries to keep closed, and it was in this space between fear and lucidity that the flashbacks began. I remembered an old case, an isolated community on the outskirts of Manaus, where people disappeared after hearing the forest calling. At the time, I concluded it was mass delusion, but now I wasn't so sure. I picked up my notebook and flipped through my old notes. Among the scribbles and reports, I found references to a similar ritual. Dating back more than 100 years, words like purification, rebirth, and voice of the waters appeared repeatedly. The same symbol engraved on the necklace was also there, drawn in the margin of a page. I had seen it before, I just couldn't remember where, and this uncertainty gnawed at me. The more I connected the dots, the more one question haunted me. What if what I'm seeing isn't a coincidence, but a pattern? Perhaps the kind of thing that repeats itself when someone dares to gaze too long into the abyss. I've always considered myself a skeptic, a rational investigator, but there's a fine line between investigating the impossible and being swallowed by it. At that moment, I realized something unsettling. The voices of the island, the symbols, the legends, Everything seemed to echo within my own mind, as if every old case I had solved was guiding me there. And, for the first time, I began to wonder if I had chosen this investigation, or if the island had chosen me. The next day, I decided to search the huts farthest from the beach. Most had already collapsed, overgrown with roots and moss, but one seemed to have withstood the test of time for some reason I couldn't explain. Inside, the floor was covered in scattered papers, some so old they crumbled to the touch. Among them, I found a yellowed drawing, drawn in pencil and charcoal. A rudimentary map of the island. The lines were irregular, almost childlike, but the center of the drawing caught my attention. A large circle surrounded by symbols identical to those on the necklace. Below, a phrase scribbled in trembling letters, "Where the sea breathes, the veil opens." It seemed more like poetry than instruction, but I learned that, in these cases, poetry and madness go hand in hand. I followed the map's pattern with my eyes, trying to identify the landmarks. There were markings that corresponded to the beach, the huts, and even the cliff to the north. But the circle was in an area that didn't appear on any official map, the interior of the forest, where the vegetation was so dense that even the police drone hadn't managed to capture images. I tucked the paper away in my notebook, even though I felt like I was carrying something I shouldn't. As I left the cabin, the wind blew strangely, stirring up the dust and moving the map, as if trying to show me the way. That's when I realized, perhaps the island didn't hide its secrets. Perhaps it was just waiting for someone to dare to follow them. I decided not to head into the forest alone. Protocol required me to maintain contact with the support team sent by the Maritime Police, 2 experienced agents accustomed to missions in inhospitable locations. On the second day of the search, the younger one, named Ramos, suggested going a little further than the trail marked on the map. He claimed to hear a sound coming from within the forest, something like a distant current. I agreed, but cautiously. The radio signal began to fail shortly afterward. Interference, hissing, and broken voices appeared. It was as if the frequency was being sucked away by something invisible. I asked Ramos to check in every 5 minutes. But his last response was a strange noise followed by a loud crack. Aww, and then silence. I tried calling in for almost an hour, switching channels, until a metallic sound came from the forest, the sound of something breaking. I ran toward the source of the sound and found Ramos's radio broken in half, its antennas twisted. No sign of the struggle, no fresh footprints, nothing. The surrounding forest was untouched, as if he had simply been wiped away. I knelt down, trying to understand what could have happened, and felt an intense chill run down my spine, the kind that comes not from the wind, but from instinct. I looked around, and for a brief moment, thought I saw something moving among the trees, a tall, motionless silhouette, like a shadow cast by the mist. But when I blinked, it was gone. I put the damaged radio back in my backpack, and for the first time since arriving on the island, I began to feel that perhaps the next disappearance could be mine. With Ramos's disappearance still throbbing in my mind, I decided to continue alone. The map indicated that the ritual circle was near a rock formation in the heart of the island. The walk was silent and dense. The air seemed heavier the further I got from the coast. After almost an hour, I found a narrow crevice hidden among the rocks, the kind of entrance that would only reveal itself to someone who already knew how to look for it. I turned on the flashlight and entered. The light cut through the darkness like a razor, revealing inscriptions on the walls, hundreds of them, carved in hypnotic patterns. Some seemed recent, others so ancient that time had barely touched them. That's when I noticed something that made me hesitate. The symbols were pulsing, slowly, with an almost organic rhythm, as if they were breathing along with the surroundings. I approached, feeling the heat radiating from the stones. I recorded everything on video, trying to stay calm, but there was a low sound coming from the back of the cave, a murmur that rose and fell like the sound of the sea. I advanced a few more meters until I found the floor covered in bones mixed with shells and pieces of fabric. There were remains of campfires, and in the center, a circle drawn with a substance too dark to be just charcoal. For a moment, the sound ceased, and then the lantern flickered. The inscriptions on the walls shone brightly, reflecting shadows that moved on their own. I felt my heart race. Something in it was watching me, and it wasn't my imagination. It was as if the entire cave had awakened, and deep down, I knew. Perhaps the ritual wasn't over yet. After leaving the cave, I spent hours analyzing the images and comparing the symbols with my old files. That's when I found a piece of correspondence, a 1958 report filed under restricted classification. It described a sect called the Fadeaway, a group that believed the human soul needed to be freed from the body through purification by absence. The ritual consisted of offering people to the sea, believing that, by disappearing, they became part of the island's own consciousness. The more I read, the more my stomach churned. The text mentioned that the cult had originated in that very region, centuries before, and that the island was considered the point where the sea speaks to those who are not afraid to listen. Several witnesses reported hearing voices coming from the water, and some survivors, if I may call them that, claimed to remember the moment they were called, before disappearing. The notes also mentioned a necklace used in the rituals, a symbol of surrender and rebirth. It was identical to the one I had found buried in the sand. That object I carried in my backpack might not have been a simple clue, but an invitation. And somehow, I felt that accepting it had changed something within me. I stared at the sea for long minutes. The surface was calm, but the sound of the waves seemed different, deeper, almost articulate. And I wondered if those who disappeared one day truly died, or if they simply chose to erase themselves from the world as the cult taught. The nights began to blur into the days. I no longer knew how many hours I had been awake, or if I had actually slept at all. Everything seemed to revolve around a constant fog that the island exuded. And then the visions began. First subtle, like shadows at the edge of my vision. Then faces, familiar faces, the missing tourists. I saw the psychologist sitting near the rocks, writing in her notebook with the serenity of someone who still believes everything has an explanation. I saw the documentary filmmaker waving to me from the edge of the beach with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And for a moment, I heard laughter coming from the forest, the same voices recorded in the old recordings. When I ran over, I found only footprints that ended in nothingness. The strangest thing was that the voices seemed to know what I was thinking. Sometimes they whispered my own conclusions before I could say them. Other times, they called me by name, the same way Ramos had before he disappeared. I began to question everything, my sanity, my senses, even my memory. Maybe the island wasn't showing me things. Maybe it was just returning parts of me I'd tried to bury. In one of those visions, I saw my reflection in the water, but it wasn't my face looking back at me. It was that of the missing visual artist. The same eyes, the same expression. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was then that I realized the most unsettling thing of all. Perhaps I wasn't just investigating the island. Perhaps it was investigating me. The next morning, while surveying the shoreline, I noticed something in the distance, a silhouette lying among the rocks. I ran over and found a man, thin, covered in seaweed and sand, his body cold but alive. He was breathing heavily, his glassy eyes fixed on the horizon. When I tried to help him, he reacted with a hoarse cry, backing away like a frightened animal. Gradually, he began to mutter something, a Latin phrase I recognized, nunquam abierant. I spent hours trying to establish some kind of contact. He said nothing more, just repeated those words in different tones, sometimes as a prayer, sometimes as a warning. They never left. I checked his documents. He was one of the missing tourists. But how had he survived so long? And more importantly, what did they mean? I took him to one of the huts to try to warm him up. He was shivering uncontrollably, and his skin had a grayish tinge, as if life had forgotten him. Touching his pulse, I felt an irregular rhythm, something between a heartbeat and a vibration. Instinctively, I recoiled. The man then looked up for the first time and murmured in slurred Portuguese, "The tide doesn't take, it chooses." Before I could ask any questions, he fainted, and the instant his head fell, the sea began to recede, revealing a strip of sand that hadn't been there before. It was as if the island was reacting to him, or to what he was carrying. And for the first time, I realized that perhaps what disappears here never truly goes away. When the rescued man fell asleep, I took the time to rummage through his belongings. Among a torn backpack and soaked clothes, I found a notebook wrapped in plastic. It was a diary, and judging by the notes, it belonged to the documentary filmmaker, the tour group's leader. The first few pages described the purpose of the trip, a scientific expedition to record local legends about disappearances on isolated islands. All very rational, until the tone began to change. In the following pages, curiosity turned to fascination. He wrote about chants, symbols, and theories about bridges between planes, as if the island were a portal between the physical world and something beyond. Most disturbingly, his final notes didn't have the tone of someone studying a phenomenon, but of someone experiencing it. "The energy is calling us," he said in one line. "There are no longer observers here. We are part of the experiment now." The diary also revealed something darker. The group hadn't come to the island by chance. They had received an anonymous letter with coordinates and detailed instructions about the ritual. Something to be performed during high tide, when the sea speaks loudest. None of them seemed to truly believe it, until they started hearing the voices. I closed the diary with trembling hands. Scientific curiosity had become blind faith. They were searching for answers about the unknown, and the unknown had answered. And as I reread those words, something within me began to recognize the same impulse, that dangerous desire to understand what perhaps should never be understood. After reading the diary, I felt as if a part of me had been exposed. The documentarian's words echoed in my mind, mingling with my own thoughts. I've always investigated the irrational, with the coldness of someone who believes in method, logic, and evidence. But there, faced with everything I saw, I began to wonder if this stance wasn't just a sophisticated way of denying fear. Because fear, it was in my every breath. I spent hours staring at the sea, trying to find answers where there was only silence. And it was in this emptiness that I began to feel something different. A strange kind of connection with the island, as if the sound of the waves followed the rhythm of my heart. I knew it was absurd, but I couldn't help it. Part of me seemed to recognize that call, as if the ritual described in the diary were a dormant memory. Guilt also crept in. Guilt for having brought myself here, for having underestimated the signs, for having believed the unknown could be controlled like an experiment. Maybe, deep down, I wasn't just investigating. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself or to someone who's no longer here. The boundaries between my role as investigator and participant were blurring. When I realized it, I was unintentionally repeating the same words I'd read in my diary. "The energy is calling us," I whispered, just to test it. But the air around me seemed to vibrate in response, and it was in that instant that I realized maybe fear wasn't the enemy. Maybe it was the invitation. The first thing I felt was a change in the air. The wind stopped, as if the world had held its breath. Then the sound of the sea began to change. It wasn't waves anymore. It was voices. Hundreds of them, whispering in different tones. Like a submerged choir trying to emerge, I stepped out of the cabin and saw the fog forming too quickly, swallowing the beach, the forest, and the sky. The island, silent until then, seemed to pulse beneath my feet. The tide rose violently, even without a storm. The waters surged toward the cabins, and the sound of voices intensified. It was then that I saw them. Human silhouettes walking through the mist, 7 of them. They stopped a few meters away from me, motionless, with faces that seemed familiar. My body reacted before my mind. They were the tourists, or what was left of them. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures watched me with eyes that shone like reflections in water, and one of them, the documentary filmmaker, reached out, pointing to the necklace I still wore. His voice echoed in my mind, soundless, mouthless. "Now you understand." And in that instant, I understood the meaning of purification through absence. It wasn't death, it was fusion. The island vibrated, alive, aware. The mist swirled around me as if to envelop me, absorb me. I could hear the same Latin phrase being repeated, endlessly, nunquam abierent. They never left. And when the sea reached me, I felt something inside me break, a thin line between what I am and what the island wanted me to be. When the tide receded, I found myself kneeling on the sand, completely soaked and unaware of how much time had passed. The mist was beginning to dissipate, and in the silence that remained, I noticed something new. The documentary filmmaker's diary lay open before me, as if the wind had placed it there. The last pages, previously blank, were now covered with recent words, written in shaky handwriting. The island delivers on its promises. I continued reading, and the revelations became increasingly disturbing. They were drawn not by curiosity, but by a promise. An ancient manuscript found by one of the tourists spoke of a force that granted continuity, not eternal life, but permanence. A kind of existence that transcends the body and time, provided the individual surrendered completely to the call of the sea. Suddenly, everything made sense. The missing had not been victims, but volunteers. The purification by absence was not punishment, it was choice. The island offered something no science, religion, or faith could guarantee: the chance to never cease to exist. It was a bargain, and they accepted. I closed the diary with trembling hands. If the promise was true, then they were all still there, not as bodies, but as part of that consciousness I could now feel pulsing beneath the sand. And deep within, a soft voice echoed in my mind, sweet and tempting. "You have been called too, Catherine. All that remains is to say yes." I woke up on the sand to the distant sound of an approaching engine, a rescue boat. I couldn't remember how I got there, nor how much time had passed since the last high tide. My equipment was scattered, but the camera, curiously, remained intact. One of the agents pulled me aboard, talking to me, but all I could hear was the sound of the sea. He seemed to be whispering something, almost as if saying goodbye. I was taken to the mainland in silence. On the way, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words didn't seem to make sense outside the island. The team looked at me with a mixture of relief and distrust. When we arrived at the base, I handed the camera to the experts and retreated to a corner, trembling with exhaustion. I wanted to believe that it was all just a delusion caused by trauma and isolation, but their gaze, minutes later, said otherwise. They called me in to view the recovered footage. The video began with me narrating the investigation, everything normal. Then the footage shook, the tide rose, and voices echoed. But what came next froze me. There I was, surrounded by tourists, my feet in the water, repeating Latin words, smiling as the sea enveloped me. And in the last scene before the screen faded to black, I looked directly into the camera and said, "They never left." Since then, the authorities have classified the case as an inexplicable phenomenon. I myself reviewed the images several times, trying to find a cut, a trick, any flaw that would explain it. But there was nothing. And sometimes, when the wind blows from the sea, I still hear the voices, calling my name, as if the island were still waiting. Do you know what I learned on the Isle of Morwen? That not every disappearance is a loss. Sometimes it's transformation. Sometimes it's just a part of us trying to escape something we can't face. Those people, maybe they didn't disappear. They just chose to exist in another way. And deep down, I understand. Because there are pains that don't resolve themselves. They only dissolve. For a long time, I thought truth was a straight line. Cause, effect, solution. But the island taught me that truth is a circle. The more you try to escape it, the more you end up back at the same point. And maybe that's what's so frightening, realizing that the mystery isn't always out there, but rather within us. Today, when I close my eyes, I still hear the sound of the sea. Not with fear, but with respect. Because some answers weren't meant to be discovered, but rather felt. The true investigation is the one that continues even after the case is over, inside our own minds. If you also believe that mystery is what keeps the world moving, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with me on future investigations. Because, after all, the unknown never sleeps.